Today we will be reading a little bit more of The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin. Very excited. I wonder if that would work better. A little zoomed in. Take advantage of our space. Come on, team. Let's assemble. I'm not going to start right away. I'm going to wait till I see a couple people. Come on, guys. Let's get a smile on that face. Yes, more Kropotkin. Yes. Carl, too, made it. Congratulations. Congratulation. Is this anarchism? Yes, we are doing another anarchy stream. Congratulation. You have just completed a great game. So, now that there's a couple of people in the room, I want to talk about this. Before I get into reading more Kropotkin, I want to talk about this. I think it pertains to the topic, you know, because we're going to be talking about capitalism and whatnot. I am so excited to see fast food manager Gangle in the next episode of Digital Circus. I am so excited for this. When I saw that this was what they were going to do with Gangle in this episode, make him the manager, or make her the manager, I guess it's a she. I thought that was the best idea ever. And I love this different mask that they're using. Oh, hold on. There's someone at the door. I apologize. I have to interrupt this stream for a bit. Because I am needed for a minute or two. But I will come back shortly. I'll just mute it right here and then I'll be back. I'm back. Anyway, let's read the comments. The UHC assassin was arrested. He seems to have been inspired by Ted Kaczynski. Theodore Kaczynski himself. That would be a disappointing role model. Yeah, he seems like one of those Ivy League tech bro who had an emotional breakdown. It would be very convenient if he wasn't actually upset for emotional reasons. Hold on. I think something's wrong about the way this thing is configured. Does it look weird on the stream? I can never tell with these. The way OBS sets it up, I'm never sure. Alright. He seems to have had back problems and probably went through some medical trauma, so his target makes sense. He uploaded a YouTube video called The Truth. Really? He uploaded a video? So he wasn't even trying to get away with it? Going to have some dinner, we'll be back. I was on my way to bed when this stream started, now I think. God damn it. Really? I guess 1968 might still be here. I start this stream and then I'm gone for like 20 minutes. And everyone's leaving. Fine then. I'll just read about anarchism without you. Chapter 3. Anarchist Communism. One. Dang it. 1. Every society which has abolished private property will be forced, we maintain, to organize itself on the lines of communistic anarchy. Anarchy leads to communism, and communism to anarchy, both alike being expressions of the predominant tendency in modern societies, the pursuit of equality. Time was when a peasant family could consider the corn which it grew, or the woolen garments woven in the cottage, as the products of its own toil. But even then, this way of looking at things was not quite correct. There were the roads and bridges made in common, the swamps drained by common toil, and the communal pastures enclosed by hedges which were kept in repair by each and all. If the looms for weaving or the dyes for coloring fabrics were improved, all profited. So even in those days, a peasant family could not live alone, but was dependent in 1,000 ways on the village or the commune. But nowadays, in the present state of industry, when everything is interdependent, when each branch of production is knit up with all the rest, the attempt to claim an individualist origin for the products of industry is absolutely untenable. The astonishing perfection attained by the textile or mining industries in civilized countries is due to the simultaneous development of 1,000 other industries, great and small, to the extension of the railroad system, to interoceanic navigation, to the manual skill of thousands of workers, to a certain standard of culture reached by the working classes as a whole, to the labors, in short, of men in every corner of the globe. You know, I think we covered this already in the last chapter. I don't know why he feels the need to reiterate this point. I feel like we could get on with it. The Italians who died of cholera while making the Suez Canal, or of ankylosis, I don't even know what that is. Never heard of that. Ankylosis in the St. Gothard Tunnel. I don't know what that is either. And the Americans mowed down by shot and shell while fighting for the abolition of slavery have helped to develop the cotton industry in France and England, as well as the work girls who languish in the factories of Manchester and Rouen, and the inventor who, following the suggestion of some worker, succeeds in improving the looms. How then shall we estimate the share of each in the riches which all contribute to amass? That's a good question. How shall we estimate the share? Looking at production from this general synthetic point of view, we cannot hold with the collectivists that payment proportionate to the hours of labor rendered by each would be an ideal arrangement or even a step in the right direction. I agree with that, but probably not for the reason he's saying. That's interesting. So the collectivists would then be the Bakuninists, right? They would be the people who supported Bakunin in the First International and followed his ideas of anarchism. Without discussing whether exchange value of goods is really measured in existing societies by the amount of work necessary to produce it, according to the doctrine of Smith and Ricardo, in whose footsteps Marx has followed. Yeah, I've always thought that was weird. The labor theory of value, like, I've never quite understood why this idea is so popular. Suffice it to say here, leaving ourselves free to return to the subject later, that the collectivist ideal appears to us untenable in a society which considers the instruments of labor as a common inheritance. Starting from this principle, such a society would find itself forced from the very outset to abandon all forms of wages. Okay. The mitigated individualism of the collectivist system certainly could not maintain itself alongside a partial communism, the socialization of land and the instruments of production. A new form of property requires a new form of remuneration. A new method of production cannot exist side by side with the old forms of consumption, any more than it can adapt itself to the old forms of political organization. The wage system arises out of the individual ownership of the land and the instruments of labor. It was the necessary condition for the development of capitalist production and will perish with it, in spite of attempts to disguise it as profit sharing. The common possession of the instruments of labor must necessarily bring with it the enjoyment in common of the fruits of common labor. Okay, so how are we going to do that? We hold further that communism is not only desirable, but that existing societies founded on individualism are inevitably impelled in the direction of communism. The development of individualism during the last 3 centuries is explained by the efforts of the individual to protect himself from the tyranny of capital and of the state. For a time he imagined, and those who expressed his thought for him declared, that if he could free himself entirely from the state and from society by means of money, he said, I can buy all that I need. But the individual was on the wrong tack, and modern history has taught him to recognize that without the help of all, he can do nothing, although his strong boxes are full of gold. You should read Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific by Engels. That sounds like a long book, but sounds interesting. In fact, alongside this current of individualism, we find in all modern history a tendency on the one hand to retain all that remains of the partial communism of antiquity, and on the other to establish the communist principle in the thousand developments of modern life. As soon as the communes of the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries had succeeded in emancipating themselves from their lords, ecclesiastical or lay, their communal labor and communal consumption began to develop and develop rapidly. The township, and not the private persons, freighted ships and equipped expeditions, and the benefit arising from the foreign trade did not accrue to individuals, but was shared by all. The townships also brought provisions for their citizens, bought provisions for their citizens. Traces of these institutions have lingered on into the 19th century, and the folk piously cherish the memory of them in their legends. All that has disappeared. But the rural township still struggles to preserve the last traces of this communism, and it succeeds except when the state throws its heavy sword into the balance. Meanwhile, new organizations based on the same principle to every man according to his needs spring up over 1,000 different forms. For without a certain leaven of communism, the present societies could not exist. In spite of the narrowly egoistic turn given to men's minds by the commercial system, the tendency towards communism is constantly appearing and influences our activities in a variety of ways. The bridges, for the use of which a toll was levied in the old days, are now become public property and free to all, and so are the high roads, except in the East, where a toll is still exacted for the traveler for every mile of his journey. Museums, free libraries, free schools, free meals for children, parks and gardens open to all, streets paved and lighted, free to all, water supplied to every house without measure or stint. All such arrangements are founded on the principle, take what you need. The tramways and railways have already introduced monthly and annual season tickets, without limiting the number of journeys taken. And two nations, Hungary and Russia, have introduced on their railways the zone system, which permits the holder to travel 500 or 1,000 miles for the same price. But it is a short step from that to a uniform charge, such as already prevails in the postal service. In all of these innovations and 1,000 others, the tendency is not to measure the individual consumption. One man wants to travel 1,000 miles, another 500. These are personal requirements. There is no sufficient reason why one should pay twice as much as the other, because his need is twice as great. Such are the signs which appear even now in our individualist societies. That's kind of an interesting idea, the season ticket being a sort of introduction of communistic principle into individualism. But it makes financial sense to do it that way, because you can really kind of just make it a lot simpler, and give people, make people spend a greater upfront fee for perhaps more benefit overall, reducing the cost to the individual overall if he has to take a lot of train rides. It's an interesting. I didn't even know that they had season tickets back then. But this idea of not testing by consumption, by the measure of consumption for the charge. You are back. Gotta keep him hydrated. It's an 85-page pamphlet. Oh, okay. Well, I could read that. A simple flat rate. Moreover, there is a tendency, though still a feeble one, to consider the needs of the individual irrespective of his past or possible services to the community. We are beginning to think of society as a whole, each part of which is so intimately bound up with the others that a service rendered to one is a service rendered to all. When you go to a public library, not indeed the National Library of Paris, but say into the British Museum or the Berlin Library, the librarian does not ask what services you have rendered to society before giving you the book or the 50 books which you require, and he comes to your assistance if you do not know how to manage the catalog. By means of uniform credentials, and very often a contribution of work is preferred. The scientific society opens its museums, its gardens, its library, its laboratories, and its annual conversaciones. I don't know. I don't know what that Italian word is doing in this. To each of its members, whether he be a Darwin or a simple amateur. At St. Petersburg, if you are pursuing an invention, you go into a special laboratory or workshop where you are given a place, a carpenter's bench, a turning lathe, all the necessary tools and scientific instruments provided you only know how to use them, and you are allowed to work there as long as you please. There are the tools. Interest others in your idea. Join with fellow workers skilled in various crafts, or work alone if you prefer it. Invent a flying machine or invent nothing. That is your own affair. You are pursuing an idea. That is enough. That's interesting. I didn't know about that. Was that... I wonder which czar came up with that. That sounds like a Peter the Great kind of deal, but it could have been a different one. It sounds like something a czar would have come up with, though. In the same way, those who man the lifeboat do not ask credentials from the crew of a sinking ship. They launch their boat, risk their lives in the raging waves, and sometimes perish, all to save men whom they do not even know. And what need to know them? They are human beings, and they need our aid. That is enough. That establishes their right to the rescue. Thus, we find a tendency eminently communistic springing up on all sides and in various guises in the very heart of theoretically individualist societies. Suppose that one of our great cities, so egotistic in ordinary times, were visited tomorrow by some calamity. A siege, for instance. That same selfish city would decide that the first needs to satisfy were those of the children and the aged. Without asking what services they had rendered or were likely to render to society, it would first of all feed them. Then, the combatants would be cared for, irrespective of the courage or the intelligence which each has displayed, and thousands of men and women would outvie each other in unselfish devotion to the wounded. This tendency exists and is felt as soon as the most pressing needs of each are satisfied, and in proportion as the productive power of the race increases. It becomes an active force every time a great idea comes to oust the means of preoccupations of everyday life. The mean preoccupations, not the means of preoccupations. How can we doubt, then, that when the instruments of production are placed at the service of all, when business is conducted on communist principles, when labor, having recovered its place of honor in society, produces much more than is necessary to all, how can we doubt but that this force, already so powerful, will enlarge its sphere of action till it becomes the ruling principle of social life? Following these indications and considering further the practical side of expropriation, of which we shall speak in the following chapters. Thank you, that's what I've been wanting. We are convinced that our first obligation, when the revolution shall have broken the power upholding the present system, will be to realize communism without delay. But ours is neither the communism of Fourier and the phalansterians, nor of the German state socialists. It is anarchist communism, communism without government, the communism of the free. It is the synthesis of the two ideals pursued by humanity throughout the ages, economic and political liberty. Well, he makes quite a case here. This is a really good argument for just talking about the inherent natural appeal of communism, irrespective of the practical matter of implementing it as a governing principle in all matters of life. We can at least see that communism is in one respect a universal, appealing principle, and that the thing which sort of hampers it is really this sort of the fear of being ripped off and exploited, and the distrust of humanity. But when humanity is feeling trustful and wanting to be good, we tend toward communism, which shows something about communism versus capitalism. Which one is better? Not which one is more efficacious to this or that end, but which one is more appealing to our sensibilities as human beings. It's a good way to set up the idea, I think. The flat rate question relates to socialism versus communism and why a transitory state is needed. Socialism is from each according to his ability, to each according to his work. To each according to work. Communism is from each according to ability, to each according to need/want. Not really sure why that relates to the flat rate question. It's the same for healthcare in the UK, although we have to pay for prescription these days. Yeah. That was indeed Peter the Great. It was phased out by Catherine. Well, you say it was phased out by Catherine, but this guy was writing during the reign of Nicholas II. And he was saying that he was still a thing in St. Petersburg, at least. But yeah, that does sound like a Peter the Great idea. All right. Two. In taking anarchy for our ideal of political organization, we are only giving expression to another marked tendency of human progress. Whenever European societies have developed up to a certain point, they have shaken off the yoke of authority and substituted a system founded roughly more or less on the principles of individual liberty. And history shows us that these periods of partial or general revolution, when governments were overthrown, were also periods of sudden progress both in the economic and the intellectual field. Yeah, I guess so. If we're looking at the development of Europe out of feudalism, generally, I mean, it all kind of went that direction. Now it is the enfranchisement of the communes, whose monuments, produced by the free labor of the guilds, have never been surpassed. Now it is the peasant rising, which brought about the Reformation and imperiled the papacy. And then again, it is the society, free for a brief space, which was created at the other side of the Atlantic by the malcontents from the Old World. Further, if we observe the present developments of civilized peoples, we see most unmistakably a movement ever more and more marked to limit the sphere of action of the government and to allow more and more liberty to the individual. This evolution is going on before our eyes, though cumbered by the ruins and rubbish of old institutions and old superstitions. Like all evolutions, it only wants a revolution to overthrow the old obstacles which block the way, that it may find free scope in a regenerated society. After having striven long in vain to solve the insoluble problem, the problem of constructing a government which will constrain the individual to obedience without itself ceasing to be the servant of society, men at last attempt to free themselves from every form of government and to satisfy their need for organization by a free contract between individuals and groups pursuing the same aim. Pursuing the same aim, that's the big sticking point. Is that I feel like in order for this to work, everyone has to agree to do it. But if people don't agree to do it, then you have a huge problem on your hands. And so, yeah, it can work if you have like an overriding sort of meme in the consciousness of a particular area. Like, for instance, Catalonia. Or like, for instance, Rojava. That can override any opposition to that goal. Or even the Chiapas region of Mexico. So in small areas, perhaps, at different times, we can see this coming about. But I just can't see it being possible to create a sort of worldwide new order of communist anarchism. The independence of each small territorial unit becomes a pressing need. Mutual agreement replaces law and everywhere regulates individual interests in view of a common object. All that was once looked on as a function of the government is today called in question. Things are arranged more easily and more satisfactorily without the intervention of the state. And in studying the progress made in this direction, we are led to conclude that the tendency of the human race is to reduce government interference to zero. In fact, to abolish the state, the personification of injustice, oppression, and monopoly. I don't agree with that. I think since he made this book, developments have suggested that that's not really true. That people find actually a very important role of the state in life and have their own ideas about how the state should be used. But it seems like the state is almost more important to people than it has ever been before. We can already catch glimpses of a world in which the bonds which bind the individual are no longer laws, but social habits, the results of the need felt by each one of us to seek the support, the cooperation, the sympathy of his neighbors. Assuredly, the idea of a society without a state will give rise to at least as many objections as a political economy of a society without private capital. We have all been brought up from our childhood to regard the state as a sort of providence. All our education, the Roman history we learned at school, the Byzantine Code, which we studied later under the name of Roman law, and the various sciences taught at the universities, accustom us to believe in government and the virtues of the state providential. To maintain this superstition, whole systems of philosophy have been elaborated and taught. All politics are based on this principle, and each politician, whatever his colors, comes forward and says to the people, "Give me power, and I both can and will free you from the miseries which press so heavily upon you." From the cradle to the grave, all our actions are guided by this principle. Open any book on sociology or jurisprudence, and you will find there The government, its organization, its acts, filling so large a place that we come to believe that there is nothing outside the government and the world of statesmen. The press teaches us the same in every conceivable way. Whole columns are devoted to parliamentary debates and to political intrigues. The vast everyday life of a nation is barely mentioned in a few lines while dealing with economic subjects, law, or in diverse facts relating to police cases. And when you read these newspapers, you hardly think of the incalculable number of things all humanity, so to say, who grow up and die, who know sorrow, who work and consume, think and create outside the few encumbering personages who have been so magnified that humanity is hidden by their shadows, enlarged by our ignorance. So here he is sort of taking a stab at great man history, which was definitely fair enough at the time, because I think at that time it needed to be called into question. I think now it maybe people are a little bit too what do you call it? Critical of it, because it is indeed great men who do big things and push things in different directions and move history. But at that time, that's all people ever talked about. And so there was really this sort of misconception that history just is all just about a few people in politics, when really, I mean, there were so many real people whose concerns just went totally untalked about. Unless they made it necessary to talk about them. Like in the Peasant Revolt of 1381. Or, what was that Florentine revolt called? Where the textile workers rebelled. Back in the Middle Ages. I can't remember what it was called. But yeah. He's criticizing Hegel here, who was the progenitor of great man theory through his idealistic philosophy. Okay. I'm noticing here that there's a guy named Balzac who he's talking about. I don't know who that guy is. But that's interesting. And yet, as soon as we pass from printed matter to life itself, as soon as we throw a glance at society, we're struck by the infinitesimal part played by the government. Balzac already remarked how millions of peasants spent the whole of their lives without knowing anything about the state, save the heavy taxes they're compelled to pay. See, that's kind of what I was talking about how I think today we're like more in touch with the state and think more about the state and want more from the state and think it's more important than ever before. And a lot of that is due to the success of the sort of public education system created by nationalists who wanted to do that, who wanted to give people a sense of the state in their life. Every day, millions of transactions are made without government intervention, and the greatest of them, those of commerce and of the exchange, are carried on in such a way that the government could not be appealed to if one of the contracting parties had the intention of not fulfilling his agreement. Should you speak to a man who understands commerce, he will tell you that the everyday business transacted by merchants would be absolutely impossible were it not based on mutual confidence. The habit of keeping his word, the desire not to lose his credit, amply suffice to maintain this relative honesty. The man who does not feel slightest remorse when poisoning his customers with noxious drugs covered with pompous labels thinks he is in honor bound to keep his engagements. Now, if this relative morality has developed under present conditions, when enrichment is the only incentive and the only aim, we can doubt its rapid progress when appropriation of the fruits of others' labor will no longer be... can we doubt its rapid progress when the appropriation of the fruits of others' labor will no longer be the basis of society. Yeah, but there are a lot of people who rip each other off. Ponzi schemes, for instance. Another striking fact which especially characterizes our generation speaks still more in favor of our ideas. It is the continual extension of the field of enterprise due to private initiative, and the prodigious development of free groups of all kinds. We shall discuss this more at length in the chapter devoted to free agreement. Suffice it to mention that the facts are so numerous and so customary that they are the essence of the second half of the 19th century, even though political and socialist writers ignore them, always preferring to talk to us about the functions of government. These organizations, free and infinitely varied, are so natural an outcome of our civilization. They expand so rapidly and group themselves with so much ease. They are so necessary a result of the continual growth of the needs of civilized man, and lastly, they so advantageously replace governmental interference that we must recognize in them a factor of growing importance in the life of societies. If they do not yet spread over the whole of the manifestations of life, it is that they find an insurmountable obstacle in the poverty of the worker, in the castes of present society, in the private appropriation of capital, and in the state. Abolish these obstacles, and you will see them covering the immense field of civilized man's activity. The history of the last 50 years furnishes a living proof that representative government is impotent to discharge the functions we have sought to assign to it. In days to come, the 19th century will be quoted as having witnessed the failure of parliamentarism. But this impotence is becoming evident to all. The faults of parliamentarism and the inherent vices of the representative principle are self-evident, and few thinkers who have made a critical study of them, J.S. Mill and Leverdays, did but give literary form to the popular dissatisfaction. The few thinkers. It is not difficult indeed to see the absurdity of naming a few men and saying to them, make laws regulating all our spheres of activity, although not one of you knows anything about them. Yeah, exactly. I think that the representative system of democracy is a terrible system. And we should get rid of it and replace it with something else. Like anything else would be better. Any other form of democracy. It's like we have the worst kind of democracy we could come up with. We are beginning to see that government by majorities means abandoning all the affairs of the country to tide waiters who make up the majorities in the House and in the election committees, to those, in a word, who have no opinion of their own. But mankind is seeking and already finding new issues. The International Postal Union, the railway unions, and the learned societies give us examples of solutions based on free agreement in place instead of law. In place and instead of law. That's an interesting phrase. Today, when groups scattered far and wide wish to organize themselves for some object or other, they no longer elect an international parliament of jacks of all trades. No, where it is not possible to meet directly or come to an agreement by correspondence, delegates versed in the question at issue are sent to treat with the instructions endeavor to come to an agreement on such or such a question, and then return not with a law in your pocket, but with a proposition of agreement which we may or may not accept. Exactly. Like, if we had something like that, that would be better. You know? A delegate system. Such is the method of the great the learned societies and the associations of every description which already cover Europe and the United States, and such should be the method of an emancipated society. When bringing about expropriation, society cannot continue to organize itself on the principle of parliamentary representation. A society founded on serfdom is in keeping with absolute monarchy. A society based on the wage system and the exploitation of the masses by capitalists finds its political expression in parliamentarism. But a free society, regaining possession of the common inheritance, must seek in free groups and free federations of groups a new organization, in harmony with the new economic phase of history. Every economic phase has a political phase corresponding to it, and it would be impossible to touch property without finding at the same time a new mode of political life. Honoré de Balzac, realist author, is probably who he was citing. President James Dean. Hey, how long has the stream been going? It's been going for an hour and 17 minutes, although about 30 of those minutes were me away doing something else. Chapter 4, Expropriation 1. It is told of Rothschild that, seeing his fortune threatened by the Revolution of 1848, he hit upon the following stratagem. "I am quite willing to admit," said he, "that my fortune has been accumulated at the expense of others. But if it were divided tomorrow among the millions of Europe, the share of each would only amount to 5 shillings. Very well, then, I undertake to render to each his 5 shillings if he asks me for it." Having given due publicity to his promise, our millionaire proceeded as usual to stroll quietly through the streets of Frankfurt. 3 or 4 passers-by asked for their 5 shillings, which he disbursed with a sardonic smile. His stratagem succeeded, and the family of the millionaire is still in possession of its wealth. That's pretty clever. It is in much the same fashion that the shrewd heads among the middle classes reason when they say, "Ah, expropriation, I know what that means. You take all the overcoats and lay them in a heap, and everyone is free to help himself and fight for the best." But such jests are irrelevant as well as flippant. What we want is not a redistribution of overcoats, although it must be said that even in such a case the shivering folk would see advantage in it. Nor do we want to divide up the wealth of the Rothschilds. What we do want, is so to arrange things that every human being born into the world shall be ensured the opportunity in the first instance of learning some useful occupation and becoming skilled in it. Next, that he shall be free to work at his trade without asking leave of master or owner, and without handing over to landlord or capitalist the lion's share of what he produces. As to the wealth held by the Rothschilds or the Vanderbilts, it will serve us to organize our system of communal production. The day when the laborer may till the ground without paying away half of what he produces. The day when the machines necessary to prepare the soil for rich harvests are at free disposal of the cultivators. The day when the worker in the factory produces for the community and not for the monopolist. That day will see the workers clothed and fed, and there will be no more Rothschilds or other exploiters. No one will then have to sell his working power for a wage that only represents a fraction of what he produces. So far, so good, say our critics. But you will have Rothschilds coming in from outside. How are you to prevent a person from amassing millions in China and then settling amongst you? How are you going to prevent such a one from surrounding himself with lackeys and wage slaves, from exploiting them and enriching himself at their expense? You cannot bring about a revolution all over the world at the same time. Well then, are you going to establish custom houses on your frontiers to search all who enter your country and confiscate the money they bring with them? Anarchist policemen firing on travelers would be a fine spectacle. But at the root of this argument there's a great error. Those who propound it have never paused to inquire whence come the fortunes of the rich. A little thought would, however, suffice to show them that these fortunes have their beginnings in the poverty of the poor. When there are no longer any destitute, there will no longer be any rich to exploit them. Let us glance for a moment at the Middle Ages, when great fortunes began to spring up. A feudal baron seizes on a fertile valley. But as long as the fertile valley is empty of folk, our baron is not rich. His land brings him in nothing. He might as well possess a property in the moon. What does our baron do to enrich himself? He looks out for peasants, for poor peasants. If every peasant farmer had a piece of land, free from rent and taxes, and if he had, in addition to those tools, the stock necessary for farm labor, who would plow the lands of the baron? Everyone would look after his own. But there are thousands of destitute persons ruined by wars or drought or pestilence. They have neither horse nor plow. Iron was costly in the Middle Ages, and a draft horse still more so. All these destitute creatures are trying to better their condition. One day they see on the road at the confines of our baron's estate a notice board indicating by certain signs adapted to their comprehension that the laborer who is willing to settle on this estate will receive the tools and materials to build his cottage and sow his fields, and a portion of the land rent-free for a certain number of years. The number of years is represented by so many crosses on the signboard, and the peasant understands the meaning of these crosses. So the poor wretches swarm over to the baron's lands, making roads, draining marshes, building villages. In 9 years he begins to tax them. 5 years later, he increases the rent. Then he doubles it. The peasant accepts these new conditions because he cannot find better ones elsewhere. And little by little, with the aid of laws made by the barons, the poverty of the peasant becomes the source of the landlord's wealth. And it is not only the lord of the manor who preys upon him. A whole host of usurers swoop down upon the villages, multiplying as the wretchedness of the peasants increases. That is how things went in the Middle Ages, and today is it not still the same thing? If there were free lands which the peasant could cultivate if he pleased, would he pay £50 to some shabble of a duke for condescending to sell him a scrap? Would he burden himself with a lease which absorbed a third of the produce? Would he, on the métayer system, consent to give the half of his harvest to the landowner? But he has nothing, so he will accept any conditions, if only he can keep it body and soul together, while he tills the soil and enriches the landlord. So in the 19th century, just as in the Middle Ages, the poverty of the peasant is a source of wealth to the landed proprietor. Yeah, I don't really understand the argument being offered to the anarchists in this sort of debate here. I don't really quite get the whole idea. I mean, I get some of the arguments, but I don't really get the main idea of this, what exactly he's saying. or what the point of this is. I feel like maybe this is something that could come later in the book after he's explained a little bit more about how this works. The landlord owes his riches to the poverty of the peasants. Oh, sorry, 2. The landlord owes his riches to the poverty of the peasants, and the wealth of the capitalist comes from the same source. Take the case of a citizen of the middle class who somehow or other finds himself in possession of £20,000. He could, of course, spend his money at the rate of £2,000 a year, a mere bagatelle in these days of fantastic, senseless luxury. Wow, I've never heard that word before. But then he would have nothing left at the end of 10 years. So, being a practical person, he prefers to keep his fortune intact and win for himself a snug little annual income as well. This is very easy in our society, for the good reason that the towns and villages swarm with workers who have not the wherewithal to live for a month, or even a fortnight. So our worthy citizen starts a factory. The banks hasten to lend him another 20,000, especially if he has a reputation for business ability. And with this round sum, he can command the labor of 500 hands. If all the men and women in the countryside had their daily bread sure, and their daily needs already satisfied, who would work for our capitalist at a wage of half a crown a day, while the commodities of one produces in a day sell in the market for a crown or more? Okay, but who would then work at all is my question. If people already had their daily bread sure and their daily needs already satisfied, who would work at all? Let alone for a capitalist at a wage of half a crown a day. I mean, I would like an answer to that question. Unhappily, we know it all too well. The poor quarters of our towns and of the neighboring villages are full of needy wretches whose children clamor for bread. So before the factory is well finished, the workers hasten to offer themselves. Where 100 are required, 300 besiege the doors. And from the time his mill is started, the owner, if he only has average business capacities, will clear £40 a year out of each mill hand he employs. He is thus able to lay a snug little fortune, and if he chooses a lucrative trade and has business talents, he will soon increase his income by doubling the number of men he exploits. So he becomes a personage of importance. He can afford to give dinners to other personages, to the local magnates, the civic, legal, and political dignitaries. With his money, he can marry money, and by he may pick and choose places for his children, and later on perhaps get something good from the government, a contract for the army or for the police. His gold breeds gold, till at last a war or even a rumor of war or a speculation on the stock exchange gives him his great opportunity. 9/10 of the great fortunes made in the United States are, as Henry George has shown in this Social Problems, that's another I could read, the result of knavery on a large scale assisted by the state. In Europe, 9/10 of the fortunes are made in our monarchies and republics. 9/10 of the fortunes made in our monarchies and republics have the same origin. There are not two ways of becoming a millionaire. This is the secret of wealth. Find the starving and destitute, pay them half a crown, and make them produce 5 shillings worth in a day. Amass a fortune by these means, and then increase it by some lucky hit made with the help of the state. Need we go on to speak of small fortunes attributed by the economists to forethought and frugality when we know that mere saving in itself brings in nothing, so long as the pence saved are not used to exploit the famishing? Take a shoemaker, for instance. Grant that his work is well paid, that he has plenty of custom, and that by dint of strict frugality he contrives to lay by from 18 pence to 2 shillings a day, perhaps £2 a month. Grant that our shoemaker is never ill, that he does not half starve himself in spite of his passion for economy, that he does not marry, or that he has no children, that he does not die of consumption. Suppose anything and everything you please. Well, at the age of 50, he will not have scraped together £800. He will not have enough to live on during his old age when he has past work. Assuredly, this is not how great fortunes are made. But suppose our shoemaker, as soon as he has laid by a few pence, thriftily conveys them to the savings bank, and that the savings bank lends them to the capitalist, who is just about to employ labor, i.e., to exploit the poor. Then our shoemaker takes an apprentice, the child of some poor wretch who will think himself lucky if in 5 years' time his son has learned the trade and is able to earn his living. Meanwhile, our shoemaker does not lose by him, and if trade is brisk, he soon takes a second and then a third apprentice. By and by, he will take 2 or 3 working men, poor wretches, thankful to receive half a crown a day for work that is worth 5 shillings, and if our shoemaker is in luck, that is to say, if he is keen enough and mean enough, his working men and apprentices will bring him in nearly £1 a day, over and above the product of his own toil. He can then enlarge his business. He will gradually become rich, and no longer will have any need to stint himself in the necessities of life. He will leave a snug little fortune to his son. This is what people call being economical and having frugal, temperate habits. At the bottom, it is nothing more nor less than grinding the face of the poor. Commerce seems an exception to this rule. Such a man, we are told, buys tea in China, brings it to France, and realizes a profit of 30% on his original outlay. He has exploited nobody. Nevertheless, the case is analogous. If our merchant had carried his bales on his back, well and good. In early medieval times, that was exactly how foreign trade was conducted, and so no one reached such giddy heights of fortune as in our days. Very few and very hardly earned were the gold coins which the medieval merchant gained from a long and dangerous voyage. It was less the love of money than the thirst of travel and adventure that inspired his undertakings. I don't know about that. Nowadays, the method is simpler. A merchant who has some capital need not stir from his desk to become wealthy. He telegraphs to an agent telling him to buy 100 tons of tea. He freights a ship, and in a few weeks, in 3 months, if it is a sailing ship, the vessel brings him his cargo. He does not even take the risks of the voyage, for his tea and his vessel are insured. And if he has expended £4,000, he will receive more than 5,000. That is to say, if he has not attempted to speculate in some novel commodities, in which case he runs a chance of either doubling his fortune or losing it altogether. Now, how could he find men willing to cross the sea, to travel to China and back, to endure hardship and slavish toil, and to risk their lives for a miserable pittance? How could he find dock laborers willing to load and unload his ships for starvation wages? How? Because they are needy and starving. Go to the seaports, visit the cook shops and taverns on the quays, and look at these men who have come to hire themselves, crowding round the dock gates, which they besiege from early dawn, hoping to be allowed to work on the vessels. Look at these sailors, happy to be hired for a long voyage, after weeks and months of waiting. All their lives long, they have gone to the sea in ships, and they will sail another still until they have perished in the waves. There's a school on the hill where the sons of dead fathers are led towards tempests and gales, where their God-given wings are clipped close to their bodies, and their eyes are bound round with ship's sails. Enter their homes, look at their wives and children in rags, living one knows not how, till the father's return, and you will have the answer to the question. Multiply examples. Choose them where you will. Consider the origin of all fortunes, large or small, whether arising out of commerce, finance, manufactures, or the land. Everywhere you will find that the wealth of the wealthy springs from the poverty of the poor. This is why an anarchist society need not fear the advent of a Rothschild who would settle in its midst. If every member of the community knows that after a few hours of productive toil he'll have a right to all the pleasure. That after a few hours of productive toil he will have a right to all the pleasures that civilization procures. So that's the sticking point right there, is that a person's right to the produce of society is guaranteed as long as he offers a few hours to it. Now, I'm kind of a little bit suspicious of that idea. I don't know how hard people are going to want to work if they know that their fortune is guaranteed if they do work. But we'll see how that fares, I guess. See if he addresses that. I'm not saying that's like that destroys the whole system. I'm just saying it's one thing to consider. To those deeper sources of enjoyment which art and science offer to all those who seek them, he will not sell his strength for a starvation wage. No one will volunteer to work for the enrichment of your Rothschild. His golden guineas will be only so many pieces of metal, useful for various purposes, but incapable of breeding more. In answering the above objection, we have at the same time indicated the scope of expropriation. It must apply to everything that enables any man, be he a financier, mill owner, or landowner, to appropriate the product of others' toil. Our formula is simple and comprehensive. We do not want to rob anyone of his coat, but we wish to give to the workers all those things, the lack of which makes them fall an easy prey to the exploiter. And we will do our utmost that none shall lack aught, that not a single man shall be forced to sell the strength of his right arm to obtain a bare subsistence for himself and his babes. That is what we mean when we talk of expropriation. This will be our duty during the revolution, for whose coming we look not 200 years hence, but soon, very soon. Nope. Did not happen. Soon, very soon. Did not happen that way at all. Ah, damn, wish I would have came sooner. Alright. So what he's doing here is criticizing a rent-seeking behavior, pretty much. Yeah, I don't really know what rent-seeking behavior is, although I've heard that term many times. Seems like he's also arguing for the abolition of money. Oh, yes, absolutely. Well, that's kind of key and essential to anarcho-communism, is the abolition of money. Three, the ideas of anarchism in general and of expropriation in particular still find much more sympathy than we are apt to imagine among men of independent character and those for whom idleness is not the supreme ideal. Still, our friends often warn us, take care that you do not go too far. Humanity cannot be changed in a day, so do not be in too great a hurry with your schemes of expropriation and anarchy, or you will be in danger of achieving no permanent result. Now, what we fear with regard to expropriation is exactly the contrary. We are not afraid of going far enough, of not going far enough. Sorry, we are afraid of not going far enough. We are afraid of not going far enough, of carrying out expropriation on too small a scale to be lasting. We would not have the revolutionary impulse arrested in mid-career to exhaust itself in half measures which would content no one, while producing a tremendous confusion in society and stopping its customary activities would have no vital power, would merely spread a general discontent and inevitably prepare the way for the triumph of reaction. Yeah, exactly. But it's kind of like, okay, it's really all or nothing. And so, man, you really have to go for it. And that's going to be hard. Like, I don't know if it's possible to just, on a dime, just switch to a completely different way of life. But if you don't do it, then you're opening up all this problem. Perhaps. Which is kind of why one of the reasons why I think it might be better, if you have already a society that kind of works, to just focus on working within that system. Now, if you have a system where society is collapsing under civil war, then sure, I can see the benefit of just going straight to anarchy. There are, in fact, in a modern state, established relations which it is practically impossible to modify if one attacks them only in detail. There are wheels within wheels in our economic organization. The machinery is so complex and interdependent that no one part can be modified without disturbing the whole. This becomes clear as soon as an attempt is made to expropriate anything. Let us suppose that in a certain country a limited form of expropriation is effected. For example, that as it has been suggested more than once, only the property of the great landlords is socialized, whilst the factories are left untouched. Or that in a certain city, house property is taken over by the commune, but everything else is left in private ownership. Or that in some manufacturing center, the factories are communalized, but the land is not interfered with. The same result would follow in each case, a terrible shattering of the industrial system without the means of reorganizing it on new lines. Industry and finance would be at a deadlock, yet a return to the first principles of justice would not have been achieved, and society would find itself powerless to construct a harmonious whole. If agriculture could free itself from great landowners, while industry still remained the bondslave of the capitalist, the merchant, and the banker, nothing would be accomplished. The peasant suffers today not only in having to pay rent to the landlord, he is oppressed on all hands by existing conditions. He is exploited by the tradesman, who makes him pay half a crown for a spade, which, measured by tile labor spent on it, is not worth more than sixpence. He is taxed by the state, which cannot do without its formidable hierarchy of officials, and finds it necessary to maintain an expensive army, because the traders of all nations are perpetually fighting for the markets, and any day a little quarrel arising from the exploitation of some part of Asia or Africa might result in war. Rent-seeking is the desire to generate wealth without any reciprocal productive contribution to society or individual. Okay, so just like investing money to make more money, basically. I don't know. I don't get it. I don't know what that means. I have no idea what that means. Sorry. Then again, the peasant suffers from the depopulation of country places. The young people are attracted to the large manufacturing towns by the bait of high wages paid temporarily by the producers of articles of luxury, or by the attractions of a more stirring life. The artificial production of industry, the industrial exploitation of foreign countries, the prevalence of stock jobbing, the difficulty of improving the soil and the machinery of production. All of these agencies combine nowadays to work against agriculture, which is burdened not only by rent, but by the whole complex of conditions in a society based on exploitation. Thus, even if the expropriation of land were accomplished, and everyone were free to till the soil and cultivate it to the best advantage, without paying rent, agriculture, even though it should enjoy, which can by no means be taken for granted, a momentary prosperity, would soon fall back into the... What do you call that? S-L-O-U-G-H? How do you pronounce that? In which it finds itself today. The whole thing would have to be begun over again with increased difficulties. The same holds true of industry. Take the converse case. Instead of turning the agricultural laborers into peasant proprietors, make over the factories to those who work in them, abolish the master manufacturers, but leave the landlord his land, the banker his money, the merchant his exchange, maintain the swarm of idlers who live on the toil of the workmen, the 1,001 middlemen, the state with its numberless officials, and industry would come to a standstill. Finding no purchasers in the mass of peasants who would remain poor, not possessing the raw material and unable to export their produce, partly on account of the stoppage of trade, and still more so because industry is spread all over the world, the manufacturers would feel unable to struggle, and thousands of workers would be thrown upon the streets. I have no idea what his point is here, to be honest. Let me read that over again. The same holds true of industry. Take the converse case. Instead of turning the agricultural laborers into peasant proprietors, make over the factories to those who work in them. Abolish the master manufacturers, but leave the landlord his land, the banker his money, the merchant his exchange, maintain the swarm of idlers who live on the toil of the workmen, the 1,001 middlemen, the state with its numberless officials, and industry would come to a standstill, finding no purchasers in the mass of peasants who would remain poor, not possessing the raw material, and unable to export their produce, partly on account of the stoppage of trade. I don't know why any of this would happen. I don't really understand why this would happen. And still more so because industries spread all over the world. Because industries spread all over the world, the manufacturers would feel unable to struggle. The manufacturers would feel unable to struggle? What? What does that mean? And thousands of workers would be thrown upon the streets. These starving crowds would be ready and willing to submit to the first schemer who came to exploit them. They would even consent to return to the old slavery, if only under the promise of work. Yeah, I don't know what any of that means at all. That's pronounced like cow, so slough. Okay. Slough. Or finally, suppose you oust the landowners and hand over the mills and factories to the worker without interfering with the swarm of middlemen who drain the product of our manufacturers and speculate in corn and flour, meat and groceries in our great centers of commerce. So isn't this the same as the last one? Instead of turning the agricultural laborers into peasant proprietors, make over the factories to those who work in them. Abolish the master manufacturers, but leave the landlord his land. But in this one, you're ousting the landowners and handing over the mills and factories to the workers. But weren't we handing over the factories to the workers in this one? Then as soon as exchange is arrested, the great cities are left without bread. But why would exchange be arrested? I'm confused. Like there's definitely like he's talking about something here, but it's like he's not totally explaining it in a way that like I can understand what machinery is going wrong here. Like there's some machine that's breaking here, and I don't know which one it is. So he's like, it's broken, but I'm like, how did it break? What happened? Then as soon as exchange is arrested, the great cities are left without bread, and others find no buyers for their articles of luxury. A terrible counter-revolution will take place, a counter-revolution treading upon the slain, sweeping the towns and villages with shot and shell. There would be no prescriptions. There would be prescriptions, panic, flight. Wait, what? There would be prescriptions, panic, flight, tend all the terrors of the guillotine. Weird sentence. Okay, as it was in France in 1815, 1848, and 1871. All right. He was saying you have to go all in. You can't just expropriate one of three. Yeah, I know he was saying that, but I don't know what his argument was. Like, he was saying that, but machinery breaking down. But what machinery was breaking down? I don't know. All is interdependent in civilized society. It is therefore, on the day we strike at private property, under any one of its forms, territorial or industrial, we shall be obliged to attack them all. Besides, we could not, if we would, confine ourselves to a part. Really, you think? I don't know. Oil there by the slaves of the machine. Maybe. Paris, for example, were to confine itself to taking possession of the dwelling houses or the factories, it would be forced also to deny the rights of the bankers to levy amounting to £2 million in the form of interest for former loans. The great city would be obliged to put itself in touch with the districts, and its influence would inevitably urge the peasants to free themselves from the landowner. Necessary to communalize the railways, that the citizens might. And lastly, to prevent the waste of supplies, and to guard against the trust of corn speculators, like those whom the commune fell a prey. The work of stocking its warehouses with commodity produce. So the former loans on the like houses and factories, to also deny those loans, the interest on those loans.